Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, more revelations from the Epstein files, and these ones beg the question: did Epstein conspire to bring down Theresa May? Should we be paying more or less taxes, and what's the government policy recently affected public's opinion on that question? And also, Jim Ratcliffe called to apologise for saying the UK is, quote, colonised by immigrants. I'm Helena, aka No Justice MTG, and tonight I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. For the past few weeks now, we've been covering this Epstein story. I've had to start really digging into these files, and I can't say that it's put me in the best mood ever, peeling the onion of this disgusting elite that apparently rules our world. But at least we get to tear it apart and really, ground our conversation today. So that gives me a little bit of relief, at least.
If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support, as always. And as always, you can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below. Over the last 2 weeks, we've covered the links between the current Labour government and Jeffrey Epstein in depth. That connection passes, of course, through former US Ambassador Peter Mandelson. But new documents from the US Department of Justice's Epstein files suggest that previous governments may have had even closer links. So close, in fact, that it might even appear that Epstein was coordinating a coup in their favour.
Are you running away from the big decisions again, Boris?
Mr. Johnson, do you think the Prime Minister could deliver a Brexit deal? Do you think you can do a better job as the Prime Minister, sir? Will you make a leadership in Mr. Johnson?
That was Boris Johnson back in July 2018 after he resigned as Foreign Secretary in Theresa May's government over her soft Brexit proposal. He was the third minister to resign that day in what would become a hemorrhage of hard Brexiteers from her front bench over the following days. At the same time, former Breitbart News chairman Steve Bannon was setting himself up in London, less than a year after he was sacked as advisor to US President Donald Trump in his first administration. By July 2018, Trump was urging, even threatening May to do a hard exit from the EU. On the 13th of that month, Bannon appeared on GMB with Piers Morgan and Susanna Reid.
Is he warning Theresa? You know him better than most people. Is this a warning shot to Theresa May that if you go too soft on Brexit, we will not be able to do the deal that we were originally discussing?
I don't think there's anything subtle. I think it's direct. I think he was saying, hey, we came here, and I think he feels a little misled in the fact that we're prepared to do a major free trade deal with you guys, and we've talked about it now for over a year and a half, and then to come and see that this is, I think, a softer Brexit than even anybody anticipated.
We know that Donald Trump puts America first.
Yes.
It's one of his slogans. Theresa May is in a very difficult position because
it's one of his beliefs. It's not just a slogan.
If she takes the gamble, well, exactly. If she takes the gamble of cutting ties with the EU on the basis of some future promise of a comprehensive trade deal with the United States, and actually he decides that's not in America's interests, she's stitched up.
It was a very prescient comment from Reid there. But as you can see, Bannon was pushing for a hard Brexit. But was he perhaps pushing for more? Later that day, Epstein texts Bannon. This is from the latest DOJ upload. Having fun, asked Epstein, and Bannon answers, we are overthrowing May right now. That counts, says Epstein. So you've got a former Trump advisor and at that time absolute loyalist telling a billionaire child rapist and sex trafficker who appeared to have his fingers in every political pie that we, quote unquote, are overthrowing Theresa May. But who is the we here? Is it Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein? Or is Bannon referring to some other group? Epstein even boasted about Bannon's work to another, though unidentified contact. Epstein tells his contact, Steve Bannon and I are just laughing all day. The contact then asks for the latest from Bannon, and Epstein replies, trying to overthrow the English government. The next day, Bannon makes a public announcement. In an interview with The Telegraph, Bannon declared that the moment had come for the recently resigned Boris Johnson to challenge May for the top job. The next day, the 15th of July, Bannon is back on the airwaves, this time on LBC, where he's interviewed by another pretty big Brexit figure.
Did Boris Johnson and you work together? Do you know Boris very well?
Yeah, he came over immediately. Boris came over in the first, I think, week or two to meet with Jared and myself in Trump Tower. We spent a lot of time with him, got to know him over the last year. I've always been very impressed with Boris.
Will Boris use the knife tomorrow? Will he stand up in the House of Commons, in your opinion, and try and get rid of this Prime Minister?
It's a binary function. I mean, it's if he's to have a future and to be a leader, you got to go in there and say, hey, I'm offering an alternative. Whoever's with me is with me. If you go in and just give some sort of watered down thing, I think the British people want bold action. They said that when they voted for Brexit. They understood, the working people in the middle, people in Middle England, they understand it's all kind of complexity, it's all kind of details to the deal. But what they wanted was very simple. They wanted out. They wanted their independence.
Will Boris give them independence?
We'll have to see. I got to tell you, if you look at his letter, if you look at him and his writings, you look at his book on Churchill. He's a student of Churchill. I mean, this is the inflection point. This is a defining moment.
Johnson didn't grasp that moment. Not then, anyway. But he did, if the Epstein files are to be believed, hang out with Steve Bannon. This is also from the most recent upload of Epstein files. Where are you? Asks Epstein on the 18th of July. London with Boris, replies Bannon. And that exchange continues. Epstein says, dare to be great speech, and he appends a smiley face. Laughing my arse off, replies Bannon, last night and in the press. Now, that appears to be a reference to this speech that Johnson gave in Parliament just before 3 p.m. on the 18th, one that seemed aimed at rallying a rebellion against Theresa May.
We need to take one decision now before all others, and that is to believe in this country and in what it can do. Because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the UK's admirers, and there are millions, if not billions, across the world, are fully expecting us to do what we said and to take back control and to be able to set new standards for technologies in which we excel, to behave not as rules takers, but as great independent actors on the world stage, and to do free trade deals, proper free trade deals for the benefit and the prosperity of the British people. That was the vision of Brexit that we fought for. That was the vision that the Prime Minister rightly described last year. That is the prize that is still attainable. There is time. And if the Prime Minister can fix that vision once again before us, then I believe she can deliver a great Brexit for Britain.
Now, given Bannon is talking to Epstein at about 6:30 p.m. UK time on that day that Johnson gave the speech, what does he mean by last night? Could it be that he's telling Epstein that he helped Johnson draft that speech? Now, we can't assert that, but the messages are certainly suggestive. As it happens, Theresa May managed to hang on for a few more months, despite growing discontent amongst her MPs and ministers. But that unhappiness came to the boil in November 2018. On the 9th of that month, Joe Johnson, that's Boris Johnson's brother, quit May's cabinet over Brexit. A week later, on the 15th, 7 ministers defected over Brexit. And guess who's back in town? None other than Steve Bannon, who has returned to the UK to give a speech at the Oxford Union on the 16th. Epstein messages him. On the 16th, Epstein messages him, and these are from an older upload of files in November last year. Bannon texts Epstein saying, hey, I've gotten pulled into the Brexit thing this morning with Nigel, Boris and Rees-Mogg. Can I take a rain check on the Fiat guy until I return? That's a reference to a meeting Epstein set up for Bannon in an earlier message, and Epstein gives Bannon permission to cancel it. The conversation continues. The guys, says Bannon, presumably though we can't be sure for Johnson, Farage and Rees-Mogg, are trying to move on May today/tomorrow, and I'm having a meeting right now. Bannon goes on to say that the UK is a hot mess, with Epstein advising him, I think staying as long as you can is best, so people can get the commitment of your follow-through. Bannon agrees. Later that day, presumably after the meeting referred to earlier, Epstein texts Bannon again. Will Theresa May survive, he asks. Ignore the first Bannon reply, that's about a question he asked Epstein a little earlier, but in reply to the May question, Bannon says, I don't see how, but the guys over here have no balls. Exactly my fear, says Epstein, pencil neck and all. To which Bannon replies, Boris, Gove, Rees-Mogg, David Davis, somebody has to step up. There is no challenge to May's leadership, despite the cabinet resignations. But less than a month later, on the 12th of December 2018, Theresa May faces a confidence vote of her MPs and survives. A month later, in January 2019, and she survives another confidence vote, though narrowly. It would have taken just 10 more MPs voting against her to have her knocked out. But on the 23rd of May that year, May resigned. And on that same day, Epstein messages Bannon saying Theresa May resigns. Good work. Bannon replies, May down, Merkel and Macron on Monday, to which Epstein says, yep, and Modi on board. That's a reference to India's right-wing populist Prime Minister Narendra Modi, by the way, who had won a second term that very day. Dalia, lots of questions to ask here, lots of interesting detail that we now know about this period, which has been studied so much in British political history. What does it say about all of these links between these specific people?
You know, as we have been seeing more and more coming from these Epstein files, I think for a lot of us, it's really put us in quite a strange position. And the question that I have had to ask myself is, you know, has my theory of how power operates in the world, does it explain the things that we are seeing? Because I've always tried to make a very key point that when we talk about power, we're talking about something that is structural. We're not talking about this kind of conspiratorial, 4 or 5 men in a shadowy room, deciding how the world is run. And it becomes really difficult when you read these files to not think, oh my God, was it that the whole time? And it kind of you feel like some of the most crackpot conspiratorialists are being sort of proved right with every new release of files. But what I would say is I do think that what we are seeing here is not that kind of shadowy cabal, but what we are seeing is kind of the workings of a particular faction of the ruling class, this kind of very corporatist faction of the ruling class who are organizing or trying to out-organize another faction of the ruling class, the one represented by, I guess, the kind of Theresa Mays of the world. And as much as, Bannon and his cronies like to claim that they are anti-establishment and what they are doing is in the name of an anti-establishment politics, they are actually very firmly within establishment interests. They're just duking it out within the establishment of who holds the power and exactly how that power operates. And the faction that we are seeing being organized here through and alongside Jeffrey Epstein is that hard right, anti-immigration, sort of Doge-style creative destruction, I would argue neo-eugenicist, nihilistic faction of politics that we are, heavily nativist faction of politics that we have seen gain a lot of ground over the past 5 years, especially 5 to 10 years, I would say. And that has been sold to us as a kind of organic populist moment. And what we can actually see is that there's nothing organic, there's nothing populist about the rise of that politics. It is an organized form of politics that has involved key stakeholders that include very, very powerful billionaires, tech owners, as well as the political figures that might be the more front-facing part of that faction. And they have exploited the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis, the long tail of the 2008 financial crisis, and the failure of the more centrist elements of the establishment to really speak to that fallout and that crisis. And it seems like, like Epstein was a key, amongst so many other things, was a really key power broker of that particular faction. And it helps us explain a little bit why a man like Epstein would be so invested in Brexit. Because what I would say is that it can be quite difficult to decipher, what is the ideological worldview of this man who, it seems, brokered so much power and has been doing so for so long. We don't get many insights into Epstein's actual political ideology and view of the world that he was trying to materialize through these various networks and through and alongside the abuse of children. And, because this is a man who is friends with Noam Chomsky, is friends with Peter Thiel, is friends with Bill Clinton, is friends with Steve Bannon, Donald Trump. And it's like, what is the overarching ideological framework that this man was actually invested in? And I think that the one of the few emails where we really do see it is in some of the ways in which he's talked about Brexit, and in some of these interactions that we can see here. And he describes, when Brexit happened, he emails Peter Thiel and he says, Brexit is just the beginning. And Peter Thiel says, the beginning of what? And he says, the return to tribalism, the counter to globalization, and amazing new alliances. So those are the things that he says. And that gives us one of the few insights, I think, into his worldview and what that ideology and worldview of Epstein and the very powerful men that it appears from these emails was very close to and kind of co-conspired with, not necessarily within the sex trafficking itself, but in the reorganization of the political order. It is this worldview that is so deeply invested in a hierarchy of human life. It is a belief that, and this is a through line that runs throughout these kind of political machinations that we see in these files, right through to the sexual violence and abuse of children, and that children were subjected to at the hands of Epstein. And it is this neo-eugenicist belief that human life, the global population, exists in categories, powerful and powerless. Those categories exist on a hierarchy, and the powerful have power because they are better, because they are inherently better. They are a superior race of humans. They are smarter, they are more entitled, and they should have the right to subject lesser people to whatever kind of violation and degradation and dispossession that they see fit. And that operates at multiple scales. It is the unifying theme of this world that we are getting an insight to in the Epstein files. It runs from, Ghislaine Maxwell saying that the girls that she allegedly trafficked for Epstein and his powerful friends, one of the survivors says that she literally referred to these young girls as trash, by which she means, these are girls who are from the wrong side of Florida. They are, working class, they're poor. Many of them had already experienced a form of physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime. And, they're non-starters. They're written off. What good could they serve other than being toys for the super elites? That's almost like their born function. And it runs from that right to this celebration of this return to nativism that we see through his alliance with someone like Steve Bannon, which again is rooted in this idea, not only that there should be a very small, powerful elite of people, but also that there are some groups of people, i.e., white European citizens, who exist at the top of the hierarchy, and that the rest of the world should be shut out from any resources that are seen to be theirs, and that they essentially exist to serve that very particular group of people. And we also see it in Jeffrey Epstein's, obsession with his DNA and with eugenics and with social, like genetically engineering the population in his vision of that hierarchy of human life. So what I get from when I see this particular alliance between Bannon, Boris Johnson, Modi, this kind of new right wing that has almost inexplicably gained so much power politically, financially, economically over the past 5 to 10 years, it is an essentially neo-eugenicist view of the world that runs through from the way he viewed the young children that he trafficked right to the vision that he had for politics on a global and a national scale. And I don't think we can underestimate how important that worldview of these individuals and their ability to wield their technological and political and financial influence to bring about that worldview. And that is, we are seeing the materialization of that power brokering through the rise of far-right populism and nativism. And so it just kind of affirms to me that this rise of this particular kind of right-wing politics was not this organic, natural, or inevitable populist expression, but it was quite an explicitly engineered exploitation of a crisis, the financial crisis, which exposed many of the failures of the status quo, but is shifting us towards a status quo that is actually, in many ways, a retrenchment of some of the worst things about a centrist neoliberal politics.
Now, it's worth pointing out, Dalia, that Bannon continued his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein until very shortly before the billionaire's death. Not only that, but Bannon was working with Epstein to rebuild his image very shortly before the billionaire's arrest on charges relating to sex trafficking and sexual abuse of hundreds of girls. That's despite the fact that Bannon later frequently criticised Epstein to his followers. Bannon and Epstein were so cozy that Bannon even appeared to lay out a plan in 2019. We need to work around your 38. First, we need to push back on the lies, then crush the pedo-trafficking narrative, then rebuild your image as a philanthropist. Now, it's worth pointing out that we don't know about any of what people knew about Bannon's links to Epstein in 2018 when all this Theresa May stuff was going on. We don't know what the links were between the group of people Bannon was liaising with and whether or not they knew about his conversations with Epstein at the time. But given the fact that they're still so close, even at the point at which he's wanting to potentially work with Epstein to change his image privately, and the current fallout that we're seeing at the moment with regards to the current government in this country being criticized for political appointments and political friendships that go as far as linking people to Jeffrey Epstein, there are some questions that need to be asked. There are plenty of questions that need to be asked about what these people knew at the time, now that we know all the information around how close Bannon is and still is to the British right wing in this country, given that he was, it seems, integral, if these messages are to be believed, to plots or ways in which the people were looking at overthrowing centre-right governments across Europe and replacing them with far-right ones. Dalia, what are all your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it is completely fascinating. And in many ways, I think that, you know, the Donald Trumps, the Steve Bannons, the Nigel Farages of the world really painted themselves and backed themselves into a corner and into a really difficult dilemma that I think they probably always knew was kind of coming, and we're going to maybe cross that bridge when it came to it. But it was that so much of the MAGA groundswell was articulated around this idea of drain the swamp, you know, lock her up, and around these ideas of the elite being involved in this kind of sex trafficking network, which they then link to, you know, things like immigration and all of these things. It kind of becomes this cipher for the deviance of the elite and how Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and all of these people were coming in to smash that. And I wonder what it was like for them for this whole time to see MAGA, you know, the groundswell around MAGA, to be so centered around these kinds of narratives of drain the swamp, corruption, and Epstein being a big part of that imaginary, to be playing with that fire, knowing all along that they were embedded in that in a really concrete way. Because in a way, the fact that the MAGA populism, Epstein had this really big kind of position within the imaginary of MAGA politics. You know, MAGA versus Epstein was kind of the way in which many MAGA voters saw themselves. And then it turns out that the guy that they elected on the basis of their horror at Epstein and their beliefs around how Epstein reflects a broader story about the way that power works. And then to find out that the guy that they elected was more embedded than anyone, it seems, with those networks and was part of those networks and was part of that worldview. That is almost, that kind of contradiction and irony is almost a metaphor for the broader fabrication that is right-wing populism in this moment, which is that the very things that they have run on, the anti-establishment, the we're going after the corruption, we're going after this, that, and the other, and it turning out that the call was coming from inside the house the whole time. I do wonder if, and this can go one of two ways, either it can completely break down that MAGA voting coalition and kind of break that spell that Bannon, Trump, Farage, etc., actually articulate an anti-establishment moment and feeling that is very real and is very rooted in people's real feelings and real observations. Will this moment break that spell? Or will Trump and Bannon, etc., be able to successfully, as they so often have, divert attention away from that and say, okay, actually, no, the point never was Epstein. The point was this, that, and the other. Or is the fact that it turns out that the reality was so different to the way in which this story had been sold to so many MAGA voters, will that either split that reality or will it be something that they are able to kind of narrativize their way out of? And I think what I would like to see is a kind of deeper investigation into how people who were Trump voters, who are diehard Trump voters, what they think and how they respond, how their worldview may or may not have changed as a result from realizing that their guy was also, it seems, Epstein's guy.
Now, one thing that's probably not going to help the MAGA movement's image is the fact that the Epstein files were the subject of a US congressional hearing on Wednesday, with Attorney General Pam Bondi called to give evidence. Bondi is ultimately in charge of the release of the files by the Department of Justice, and she's been criticised by victims and politicians for the way she's handled it. Critics argue that powerful figures are still being protected, given that at least 2.5 million documents are still unreleased, while many of those that are on the internet have been heavily redacted. The department also failed initially to conceal the names of many victims of Epstein's sex trafficking and rape ring, and Congress did not hold back. This was the Democratic Party representative Chuy Garcia.
Attorney General Bondi, glad you finally made it here after hiding for 4 months from this committee. I understand why you're hiding from us.
Chairman?
You're one of the worst attorney generals in our history and an instrument of Donald Trump's lawless authoritarian agenda, and I'm glad the American people are seeing who you are, how you act, and the lack of good values. You weaponize the Department of Justice to target immigrants, working families, and anyone that Trump deems an enemy of the state, all to protect real powerful criminals, including in your administration. My Democratic colleagues have focused on your cover-up of the Epstein files and your passion for protecting pedophiles and child traffickers.
There were other conflicts like this one with Ted Lieu.
There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that. This has been the most transparent presidency. He's the one that asked that those files
I'm reclaiming my time.
be
I got your
released.
answer. You said there's no evidence.
Trump asked
Mr. Chairman, please stop the clock. Stop the clock.
The legislation. This is
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Time belongs to the gentleman from California.
Okay. I'm going to put up another document from a witness who called the FBI's National Threat Operations Center, because I believe you just lied under oath. There is ample evidence in the Epstein file.
Don't you ever accuse me of a crime.
I believe you just lied under oath, and this is all on videotape. You said there's no evidence of a crime. I'm showing you, here is a witness statement who called into the FBI's Threat Operations Center. He drove Donald Trump around in a limo. He overheard what Donald Trump said to Jeffrey on his cell phone. He was so angry, he was going to stop the limo and hurt Donald Trump. And he met a girl who said she was raped by Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. She later had her head blown off, and officers at the scene said that could not have been suicide. No one at the Department of Justice interviewed this witness. You need to interview this witness immediately. Epstein should rot in hell, so should the men who patronized his operation. And as we sit here today, there are over 1,000 sex trafficking victims, and you have not held a single man accountable. Shame on you. If you had any decency, you would resign right after this hearing concludes.
I mean, is it difficult to disagree? Sorry, at this point, the fact that they've not even bothered trying to haul anybody at this point in front of any amount of accountability for featuring in all of these DOJ releases is absolutely crazy. There's huge amounts of documentation now about people who are implicated at least somewhat, at least for questioning, in terms of their relationship to Jeffrey Epstein, and they've not bothered wanting to get anybody held accountable at all. One of the most striking moments was this one, prompted by Pramila Jayapal.
To the survivors in the room, if you are willing, please stand. And if you are willing, please raise your hands if you have still not been able to meet with this Department of Justice. Please know for the record that every single survivor has raised their hand.
It's despicable. It's an image. There's a great image of all of them holding their hands up with Pam Bondi not even bothering to pay any mind or even look at them at the time. An image that I think will come to haunt the Trump administration and be alongside the image of members of the public, civilians, and their lifeless corpses having been murdered by ICE as representative of the attitude of the Trump administration. Total lack of concern for anyone other than their own. Bondi, for her part, wasn't afraid of taking some very low blows. This was her response to questioning from Democrat Becca Balint.
Also, I want the record to reflect that, with this anti-Semitic culture right now, she voted against a resolution condemning.
Oh,
is
Jewish. I just want to be clear.
Oh,
do you want to go there, Attorney General? Or do you want to go there? Are you serious? Talking about anti-Semitism to a woman who lost her grandfather in the Holocaust?
I reclaim my time.
Really?
I mean, Dalia, what much can you even say? What can you even say about this kind of interaction and the standard that is being expected of one of the most kind of powerful people in America in terms of Pam Bondi as the head of the DOJ?
The thing to remember about Pam Bondi is that Pam Bondi doesn't care what you think. Pam Bondi doesn't care what I think. She doesn't care what the survivors of Epstein think. She doesn't even really care what voters think. She has one member of the audience that she is performing for, and that is Donald Trump. And we need to remember why Pam Bondi is in the position that she is in. What qualifies her for the position of being Trump's Attorney General is the fact that she has got a track record of manipulating the law and manipulating justice systems to protect powerful men, including Donald Trump himself. Not only is this someone who has been a diehard Trump loyalist since 2016, but their relationship actually goes further back than that. When she was Attorney General in Florida, she actually was the primary reason why a lawsuit against Donald Trump's Trump University, the reason that lawsuit got dropped happened after Trump made what turned out to be illegal $25,000 donation to her PAC. We go back again to the fact that she was Attorney General in Florida. She took over as Attorney General from Florida after Alex Acosta. Alex Acosta was Trump's first Labor Secretary, who was well known for designing the sweetheart deal that basically saw Epstein evade federal sex trafficking charges, where he ended up in jail for a year on nothing but procuring sex workers. And he ended up in jail for a year, where he was able to basically leave the jail and conduct business as normal and go as and when he pleased. A sweetheart deal that is basically unprecedented within the justice system. Now, Pam Bondi herself was not responsible for that sweetheart deal, but she followed in Alex Acosta's footsteps as Attorney General of Florida and did nothing to rectify that. It's very difficult for me to believe that Pam Bondi would not have been aware that these charges had been brought up against Epstein, and she would have had access to much of the information that led to this kind of sweetheart deal. Maybe not all of it, and maybe, expecting her to intervene in an investigation that had already been closed might be a little far. But what we can say is that she was mired in a culture of cover-ups and of aiding and protecting the reputations of powerful men. And that is what she is doing right now. Her job in this hearing is not to answer the questions of democratically elected officials who are there to hold her accountable. It's not there to restore some segment of dignity to the survivors who have been failed time and time again, despite showing, now that we know the scale of this operation and the depths and the fact that people lost their lives for coming too close to exposing what was going on, the immense bravery of those women who were young girls when this all happened to them. She's not there to face any of these people. She's not there to face us. She's there to show Donald Trump that she is able to do what he has recruited her to do, which is to divert attention from his implication and the implication of others like him in the networks of power that have been exposed by the Epstein files. And she does that by what? By shouting, by yelling, by making the story, her behavior, by insulting the people that are questioning her, by making the story something other than the complicity of herself and the complicity of the people that she serves in the failure of Epstein's victims. And so when we understand that that is who Pam Bondi's audience is, that's where her bread is buttered and has always been buttered, we can understand a little bit why she has exhibited such, frankly, bizarre behavior during these congressional hearings. And again, my interest is in how do diehard MAGA voters respond to seeing that, given that Epstein and the idea of this network of power who were involved in sex trafficking children, that was so central and such a motivating factor for many of them to vote for Donald Trump. How do they respond seeing his second-hand woman, his right-hand woman, essentially showing that she is there not to actually answer these questions despite having these files and having the capacity to do so, but is there to actually protect a man who has been named over and over again in these files as at least someone who is inappropriately related to a man like Epstein, given the fact that it was an open secret, essentially, what he was up to.
I think that we are, as I say, starting to see the MAGA base kind of peel away, especially young men, where the support for Trump is created almost immediately. People who were pretty in tune with the Epstein file discourse because they're kind of the podcast sphere that brought these people into the MAGA movement, especially during the last election cycle. And there was a moment, I watched Thomas Massie being interviewed by journalists in the United States, and he claimed this was going to be bigger than Watergate. That was his claim. This will be bigger than Watergate. I think that he's right. And there's a lot of hubris in the Trump administration when a lot of the Pam Bondi's pushback was like, oh, look, the Dow Jones is doing really well. People's retirement savings funds are doing well. Why are you asking about the Epstein files? Just totally deflecting. And something as incredibly serious of a scandal as, a child sex trafficking ring that implicates huge numbers of powerful people with seemingly no ability for the Trump administration to hold any of these people accountable for the crimes that they could potentially have committed. People don't just overlook that. People aren't going to be diverted away from this. And the more and more and more that they try and deflect, as Pam Bondi continually did for 5 hours or something during these congressional hearings, will only serve to detach more of these people who've been sold this huge long string, this ball of string that they've been following from day one of the kind of Epstein stuff being popular discourse to now, we're pouring over the files from what we've seen that's been released because of the Epstein Files Transparency Act is causing a lot of these MAGA faithful to lose faith because, as we have seen, Trump's new political term in office has been terrible, and for them specifically too. Should we be paying more or less tax? This is a question that seemingly only has one answer, as tax is always something we like somebody else to pay. And it's a big problem for the Labour government too. They were elected on a pretty contradictory platform of ruling out major tax rises, whilst also promising better public services. And so they had to essentially resort to subterfuge to justify increasing taxes by around £40 billion in their first budget. In the run-up to the election, the Institute for Fiscal Studies accused both the Labour and Conservative parties of engaging in a, quote, conspiracy of silence, as both parties' manifestos did not account for real terms cuts to unprotected departments of around £18 billion. Labour's line in the run-up to the election was that their manifesto pledges didn't require tax rises, other than the small increases that they had trailed during the election. This was even called out to Darren Jones, who was Shadow Secretary-Treasurer at the time, by Novara's own Ash Sarkar.
When it comes to the Labour manifesto, there's a lot that you're not saying. What you're not saying is what you're going to do about the planned £10 billion to £20 billion worth of cuts, which were already announced in the March budget. Will they be going ahead? Will they not be going ahead? Your tax and spend plans are tiny. Now, what I think you guys are going to do, you don't want any headlines which say Labour are going to raise tax. What you're waiting to do is maybe pull some rabbits out of a hat, maybe do some reforms to capital gains, maybe you're going to fiddle around with the Bank of England rules, because lots of your plans, for example, around retaining staff in the school system or retaining staff in the NHS, that's going to cost you money. And you know that, and I know that. What the manifesto's job is to get you over the line for the election. It's not actually a plan for government. You might say it's smart politics, but it's fundamentally dishonest with the country.
It's very funny watching Darren Jones shake his head, as Astradamus there proved to be totally correct about what was happening. Like, she was absolutely right. They played up a supposed black hole in the nation's finances and fiddled around with capital gains taxes to justify their budget's tax increases. This damaging of public trust isn't just bad for political disillusionment, it's also bad for those of us, like myself, for example, who do think that taxes are too low, as it's a decision that has dramatically polarised public opinion in its wake. On Tuesday, the National Centre for Social Research published its most recent social attitude survey, and pollster Luke Trill from More in Common has found a pretty sharp change in the opinion lurking in the data. Further striking evidence of the thermostatic reaction against higher taxes from the British Social Attitude Survey out today, number backing higher taxes for higher health spending drops to 36%, while the number supporting reductions in taxes and spending hits a record high. Similar on welfare spending, matches what we increasingly heard in focus groups over the past year. Sense system isn't rewarding contribution enough, but also notable as they highlight a particular decline in numbers, saying pensions should be priority for more spending on benefits. Which is interesting to me, because I think that taxes are probably still too low. If you look at taxation as a percentage of GDP, it's still lower in this country than kind of similar countries in Europe that have similar economies to ours and that have bigger public spending and have the kind of social welfare states, have the kind of public services that people in this country say that they want. They say they want to have the kind of top-tier public services that you'll get on the continent. And yet, whenever we see tax rises, because again, this is the kind of the first big set of tax rises that we've seen since 2010, that's immediately negatively polarised people towards the concept of being able to create what we see Rachel Reeves kind of trying and failing to do, which is a new social contract where we say, look, people will pay a little bit more in tax, businesses may pay a bit more, but you'll get a return in public services. The issue, of course, is that there was no buy-in. There was no democratic buy-in for these tax rises. People have been sold a prospectus for government that did not come to fruition and have seen something else that's been put in its place, a bunch of tax rises with which she did not get a mandate from the public to deliver because they were not in the manifesto to begin with. People rightfully feel conned. And the fact that that has negatively polarised people towards what, in my mind, is a pretty small amount of tax rises. I think we could be looking at more tax rises on wealth, for example, and more tax rises in equalising capital gains with income tax. And I think, yes, plenty of people who pay PAYE could stand to pay a little bit more too, similar to the fact that people on terms of income tax in Nordic countries, things that are economies that work much better than ours do, also pay more in tax as well. And what have they done with this? They've also at the same time run about how they need to reduce the welfare state by cutting things like the limited capability for work-related activity benefit that disabled people need to claim and people with incapacity need to claim. And they have they've manufactured consent for more cuts to welfare because they've said that it's necessary. They've taught the public that it's necessary, whilst saying to people, well, we only had to raise these taxes once and we didn't want to do it, but we had to do it, even though we didn't ask the public whether they would accept that in the first place in the run-up to the election. And that's damage. That's damaged public trust in politics, but it's damaged the social democratic kind of consensus that they're trying to build, as I said before, which, if we actually wanted to see a better economy in this country, if we wanted to have better public services, if we wanted to be able to bring more public services into public ownership, we would want those taxes to go up as well, to be able to afford a kind of welfare state that would be better. That is now going to be increasingly impossible to sell to the public because of Rachel Reeves's subterfuge and deception, because of Morgan McSweeney's desire to sell Labour to a bunch of middle-class Middle Englander types who didn't want to pay any more tax by restricting Labour in terms of what taxes that they could potentially raise at the budget as well, or indeed they could have raised in the manifesto, meaning that what have we sold? All of that public goodwill that previously existed, as we see from those statistics, towards a potential increase in spending. Very little. We've seen some increases in NHS spending, granted. I'm glad that they're there. We're seeing waiting lists come down. We've not seen substantial increases in the welfare state other than the 2-child cap being removed, which they were pushed into doing so by losing votes to the Green Party. Precious little else. Precious little else in terms of what they could actually use additional tax revenue for to be able to improve public services and indeed potentially improve the welfare state, or cancel, for example, some level of student debt or make student loans less punishing, and instead they've done the opposite because they haven't bothered touching things like the triple lock as well. This is such a big damage that she's done by not actually having an honest prospectus for government, and long term, we're going to see what we've seen in the polls recently, which is Kemi Badenoch being preferred as Prime Minister to every other political candidate, because she's running on a platform of saying we need to cut taxes, and we need to cut taxes by cutting welfare. That's the kind of politics that's now being engendered by this subterfuge of Rachel Reeves. And I think this is going to have long-lasting consequences for people who want to push left-wing politics in this country. Dalia, do you think my assessment is correct, or do you think that we can still win the public over?
I mean, I think you're completely right in the sense that ever since, Blairism, we have seen a refusal from the British Labour Party to really fight the political war. And one of these political wars is regarding, the long tail of Thatcherism and neoliberalism, which is when this political narrative around taxes really began, because it is that neoliberal ideology of low taxes, low welfare services, a small public sector that has been unanimously accepted across the mainstream British politics, and we have yet to see, other than maybe Corbynism, a mainstream political vehicle within the UK to really fight that argument. Because I really do believe that it is not an inherent, I don't think that people inherently and always will be against taxes. When you look at actually the things that people, if you ask people point blank, do you want to pay more taxes? Of course, most people are going to say, no, I don't want to pay more taxes. And a big reason for that is because people have a really stark sense that the taxes that they pay do not go to the things that they actually care about. If your taxes, it's the same way with us, Helena, we're not pro taxes regardless of what those taxes are being spent on. I too resent the fact that, I am paying taxes that aren't going into housing people, that aren't going into our education system, that isn't really going into improving our NHS, but actually a significant amount of that tax money is being used to service, 10, 15-year long PFI contracts that are actually doing the exact opposite and are turning our public services into profit-making opportunities or money-making opportunities for, crony capitalists. I too resent high taxes in that context. Whereas if there was a sense of two things, first of all, that taxes that are raised are actually going directly on the public services and the public sector that we care about, education, healthcare, infrastructure, all of these things that routinely in polling people believe should be fully part of the public sector and should not be being privatized through the back door. And second of all, that taxes are being paid according to your ability to pay them. What do I mean by that? I mean that people who are on, moderately middle class or even upper middle class incomes are not having to foot a significant amount of the tax bill at the same time as people who have passive wealth sources, people who have amount of wealth that could not possibly spend in their lifetime, in their children's lifetime, in their grandchildren's lifetime, is being left untouched. When we know that a 2% annual tax of wealth over £10 million could basically pretty much almost completely close that NHS funding gap, it becomes very difficult then to hear that, ordinary working people should be footing that tax bill. But this is all a product, this perversion of our understanding of what tax is and what the potential of a good tax system could be, and this sort of immediate knee-jerk consensus that any tax equals bad, that any government that wants to, any party that wants to get into government has to run on low taxes. The way we pierce that is by having a really honest conversation about who should be paying that tax and who is not currently paying that tax because they have the ability to manipulate our tax system to basically evade those taxes. And also to have an honest conversation about what those taxes are being spent on. The problem is that these taxes are being used to service contracts that enrich the broader networks of our politicians rather than being put directly into the services that will improve our lives. Because as you say, Helena, all the things that we know people want, which is a better state education system, a better, publicly funded, publicly owned NHS, more social housing, better quality social housing. These are all things that you cannot get to without taxes. Where the frustration actually lies is in the design and the power distribution of that tax system. It's not with tax themselves. But unfortunately, we have not seen yet, other than Corbyn really, a Labour Party politician, a Labour Party leader who has been willing to take on that story and willing to take on that narrative. Instead, they're trying to kind of get there through the back door or to manipulate the books in a way that means that they technically aren't raising taxes, or they technically might not be raising taxes, but in reality, everyday working people are having to either see that materialize through a decline in their public services or a real terms tax increase, when really the frustration is not with the idea of a tax system, it's with the idea of the fact that our tax system right now doesn't service the things we want it to service, and it's also not being fairly distributed amongst the powerful. This is all a product of the fact that the political elite in this country refuse to tackle the elephant in the room, which is that once you get past a particular level of wealth, which is a level of wealth that you and I will never see in our lifetime, and we'll probably never even know people who have access to that level of wealth, are able to pay their way out of paying their fair share of tax. And that is actually where the struggle and where the problem lies. It's not in taxes themselves.
Multi-billionaire Jim Ratcliffe is the CEO of petrochemical company Ineos, but is most known for being a minority shareholder in Manchester United FC. But yesterday, for some reason yet to be deciphered by us here at Novara Media, Sky News decided to give him a platform, and he shared his thoughts on immigration and welfare. And what he said has caused quite a stir.
If you really want to deal with the major issues of immigration, with people opting to take benefits rather than working for a living, if you want to deal with that, then you're going to have to do some things which are unpopular and show some courage.
And has this government done that?
No, I think they I don't know whether it's just the apparatus that hasn't allowed Keir to do it, or he's maybe too nice. He's a nice, I mean, I know Keir, he's a nice man, I like him. But it's a tough job, and I think you have to do some difficult things with the UK to get it back on track, because at the moment, I don't think the economy is in a good... You can't afford... you can't have an economy with 9 million people on benefits and, huge levels of immigrants coming in. I mean, the UK is being colonised. It's costing too much money. It will cause. It'll cause. Well, the UK is being colonised by immigrants, really, isn't it? I mean, the population of the UK was 58 million in 2020. Now it's 70 million. That's 12 million.
Now, it's worth pointing out that he's just wrong here. We haven't seen a population increase of 12 million. It's been close to 3 million, as our population was around 67 million in 2020, not 58 million. There's quite a different number to Ratcliffe's assertion there. But it's the language around colonisation that's been picked up on, however, going as far as the desk of the Prime Minister himself. Offensive and wrong, Britain is a proud, tolerant and diverse country. Jim Ratcliffe should apologise, Keir Starmer says. That's not very island of strangers now, is it, Keir? And given that the government's hawkish migration policy is tailored specifically to woo reform-curious voters, Farage has leapt to Ratcliffe's defence. Britain has undergone unprecedented mass immigration that has changed the character of many areas in our country. Labour may try to ignore that, but reform won't. So who's in the right? On BBC's Newsnight, the question was put to Times columnist, Tory convert and former England table tennis #1 Matthew Syed.
On immigration, I don't like the language. I think that's unfortunate. We've not been colonised in any meaningful sense. But where I agree with the thrust of what he's saying, it's not so much for me about economics, but democracy. People did not vote for this size of influx into the country. The Conservatives consistently said they would cut immigration to the tens of thousands. It spiked to levels that are completely unprecedented in the history of this country. It's had very dramatic impacts on people's access to housing, pressure on infrastructure. That, I think, goes to the heart of the collapse in trust in British politics. There's other dimensions to it, but I think that is fundamental.
Now, I'll respond to his comments around infrastructure and housing later on, but it's worth pointing out he isn't wrong in terms of the democratic deficit here. Not just Tory governments, but Labour oppositions and many other opposition parties have all run on lower immigration. It's clearly been the uniting position that many members of the country not only vote for, but care deeply about. I mean, you look at the Brexit referendum as more evidence of the fact that there was a large section of people who wanted to vote for Brexit because they thought it would reduce immigration. I think that was probably incorrect, as we saw it increase even after Brexit anyway. But regardless, that was the state of play in the political mind of the country at the time. And they were let down by government after government, although there probably were reasons why they still allowed that migration to happen, which will become clear when we move to the next comments, as Saeed was then asked about Ratcliffe's comments on the welfare state specifically.
The benefit system, the welfare system, has gone out of control, particularly sickness benefits.
Yeah.
And this is at a time when we desperately need to spend on defence and have spent years, if not decades, relying on American military power, effectively free riding on the shoulders. And I think particularly of the blue-collar workers in America who have funded our military expenditure. And so we do have to cut it back.
I mean, most of the benefits are obviously pensions, aren't they? It's about 13 million pensioners.
But at the same time, we have a debt to GDP ratio of 100% and rising. And because we have an ageing population, that could explode to 300% by 2060. I know this is statistics, but it is absolutely fundamental to our predicament. If we had built infrastructure, energy, houses, then we maybe could have coped with some immigrants. But to have such an influx whilst not being able to deliver the infrastructure that could accommodate them was a disaster in two different dimensions.
Now, there are two really big pieces of cognitive dissonance going on here. The first of all is him saying, well, if we just invested in infrastructure and energy and housing, then we'd have been able to accommodate the increase in population, which again isn't wrong. This guy's just joined the Conservative Party, did a whole press conference about how he was joining the Conservative Party. Who was in government not building those things? It was the Conservative Party. And what makes that even worse is they were not building these things. They were not investing in infrastructure when interest rates were 0%. We were in a liquidity trap when no one was investing despite rock-bottom interest rates from 2010 all the way up to 2019 when the Conservative Party was in power, doing the same kind of fiscal conservatism that he is now supporting, having joined the Conservative Party. As part of his speech, he was talking about fiscal profligacy on behalf of the current administration. I'm just like, you're literally advocating for the kind of investment now that the party that you have joined was totally reticent in building throughout the entirety of the time you're criticising their migration policy. It was basically free money. at 0% interest rates in terms of public investment to build council housing, to build energy, to be able to build infrastructure. And they were cutting these things in terms of capital spend and day-to-day spend. David Cameron said, cut the green crap. And now he's backing the same kind of austerity politics. The second piece of cognitive dissonance here, going back to, of course, about the increasing pension bill that will be coming down the line. He says, it's going to leave us with 300% debt to GDP ratio. And I'm like, well, yeah, we have an aging population. What do you think a really easy way of fixing this is, Matthew? How about lots of people who are of working age moving to the country to be able to support the fact that our population pyramid in this country is incredibly top-heavy? And these are people that the state doesn't have to pay to educate. And yet he's out here going, yeah, we should curb this migration even further and make our aging population problem even worse and make the productive capacity of the economy, which is necessary to be able to support those pension bills, even lower. It's a totally nonsensical position. Now, luckily for Newsnight viewers, Novara's own Ash Sarkar was on hand to bring the conversation back down to reality.
I think Jim Ratcliffe is a stinking hypocrite. Firstly, he became a tax resident of Monaco. That's £4 billion that could have gone towards British schools. The British NHS could have gone towards British defence. Instead, he decided he wanted that money for his own pockets. Secondly, if it wasn't for immigration, I think that Man United would have had about 3 of their starting 11 last night. So Kobbie Mainoo, Luke Shaw and Harry Maguire. Not really going to beat West Ham with that, are you? And the kind of language of being colonised by immigrants, that moves beyond talking about immigration as a policy, which I'm all for. We should talk about every area of policy. You're talking about people. And you're talking about people who've come here to live, to work, to have families, as though they're a hostile, occupying force, taking away your language, your culture, your ability to survive.
Yeah. So we know there are some voters who do believe that the language is being taken away, that their culture is being taken away.
Where's the language being taken away?
There are some people who believe that.
Yeah, some people believe the moon's made of cheese, but it doesn't mean they're right. In terms of culture being taken away, I'll tell you what's done it. It's the fact that we imported American-style consumerism, and there are so many things which are wonderful and unique about English culture, which got knocked down to make way for car parks and dual carriageways.
100% agree. 100% agree. De-Yankification now. It's all a girl can ask for. And again, it's true, like the real kind of cultural vandalism that we've seen is the replacement of actual local and British, whether they be from migrant or from British backgrounds or from existing British citizens' backgrounds, building business in this country that's created a kind of a tapestry of what our country looks like today. And I am all for this. The way you vandalise that is replacing it with identical, soulless American corporate chains. You take culture that's been here for thousands of years, that's been enriched by people coming here, making a life and building their own existence in this country and bringing their culture with them and having cultural exchange with the existing people who live here, that gets bulldozed over by the latest American chain coming and bulldozing through it, as I said before. This is kind of esoteric, but one of my favourite things about this country is because we have been so continuous in terms of the way in which that our country has existed for so long, and that there's been like regional accents, for example, have stuck for century after century. And people will come here from other countries, they'll move here and they'll set up a life here. For example, there's a very famous kind of Bosnian refugee, posts a lot on Twitter, on TikTok, he's an MBE. And he moved during the Bosnian refugee crisis to Newcastle. And he's got this Bosnian Newcastle accent, and that's such a uniquely British thing. Does that happen when American megacorporations buy our high streets? That kind of thing doesn't happen. It's such a uniquely British part of what our culture has given us. The previous example, that you just can't have the same thing when it comes to the domination of the Yankification that we've seen over the last kind of 30 years or so. Dalia, what's your take?
2 things. First of all, these anti-immigrant millionaires and billionaires are not against freedom of movement. We need to be really clear about that. They are against freedom of movement for regular people because the world that these people occupy is completely borderless. They have free reign to move themselves and their money as they please. And God forbid you question their right to do so. Ash was completely right to bring up the fact that Jim Ratcliffe changed his tax residency to Monaco in order to not pay British rates of tax. And that just goes to show that, you can make a bunch of money running, an English football club paid for by English football fans. But when the money actually is meant to be put back into that system, you decide to fence it off and move it and build up a tax residency in a country that realistically, let's not be delusional here, you have no ties to other than your desire to take advantage of their tax system. If they want to live, if the super rich who are running these media corporations telling us that immigrants are ruining the country, or who want to go on the media and say these kinds of things, if they want to move either where their money is, where their assets are, where they live, if they want to move for any reason, whether it's, protecting their wealth, or even if it's just because they like the food and the lifestyle somewhere, they believe they have a right to do that. And if you say, well, I actually don't think that you should have a right to move your money to a different tax jurisdiction from where you're making it, just because you don't want to pay taxes back into the system from which you made that money, oh my gosh, they'll call you jealous. They'll say, this is the envy of the poor. They'll say that you're curbing their freedom. But if you want to move country because the country where you live in and the conditions where you exist make it untenable for you to support you and your family, a condition which, by the way, is part of the long tail of actual colonization, not the imagined colonization that Jim Ratcliffe is conjuring up, then you will be called a scrounger just because you want to make a living that can sustain you and your family, and you want to live a dignified life while doing it. And another thing to remember as well is that a lot of these anti-immigration billionaires and millionaires benefit a huge amount from immigration. Whether we're talking about an oil company, this is an oil executive. If you think the oil industry could survive without migrant labor, and I'm talking globally here, not just within Britain, but if you think the oil industry could survive without migrant labor, you are sorely, sorely mistaken. So a lot of these super rich people would not have made their fortune without the work of migrant labor. What they want is that migrant labor to exist without any rights or pathway to any kind of settlement or citizenship. And that is the world that is envisioned by the Nigel Farages and all of them, and this kind of milieu of people. It's a world in which we get all of the benefits of migrant labor globally, but those migrant workers don't have actual full human rights and citizenship and pathways to settlement and dignity. Even if we think about the way in which it's articulated within this country, as you mentioned, Helena, the aging population, the fact that this country cannot survive without the productive capacity of migrant labor, that is not a question. That is actually not up for debate because it's pure and simple maths, right? The only thing that is actually up for debate is, do we treat those migrants like human beings when they're here? That's the only question. That's the point at which we're disagreeing on. And when it comes to the question of colonization, I just want to bring this up as well, because I do find it so deeply ironic. This is where that really useful phrase of every accusation is a confession. The Nigel Farages of the world will, fly their Union Jack and sing Rule Britannia, and then talk about how immigrants are colonizing Britain, or how immigrants are coming here and they're taking the language, they're taking over the culture, they're taking our resources. And it's like, you are just projecting, because that is exactly what your ancestors did. And that is exactly the worldview that you buy into. The belief that it is the right of white Europeans, white wealthy Europeans, to have free range over the world, to redesign political, legal, civil systems, to kill off indigenous languages, to kill off indigenous cultural practices. That's your bag. That's not our bag. And that's the great irony of both these kind of imperial nostalgia, these people who traffic in a lot of imperial nostalgia, whilst also engaging in this moral panic about immigrants taking over Britain. it comes in handy once again. Every accusation is simply a confession with this lot.
2/3 of Monegasque residents are tax exiles from other countries, right? Like, it's quite literally a colony of billionaires and Formula One drivers. As you say, every accusation a confession. Now, Jim Ratcliffe is not just controversial for his political views. His short tenure so far as a United shareholder has not been without controversy either. To find out more, I spoke to football documentarian Alfie Potshammer of the YouTube channel HITC7s about it earlier today. I began by asking him for a quick reaction to Ratcliffe's comments from yesterday.
I didn't agree with them, would be my first takeaway. I think it's not particularly surprising that a sort of tax-dodging, Brexit-supporting billionaire has some right leanings in his views of the world. I don't think that would come as a surprise to anyone. But the choice of language, which seems so pointed, and which even like doubled down on when the interviewer was sort of audibly aghast or shocked that he'd used the term like colonised, which is, I think, is a word that you actually see like quite specifically on very unusual far-right fringes online. I don't think that's like a particularly mainstream word to use about immigration, colonised. I think that was quite surprising to see someone of his, profile. I don't think it's a particularly mainstream language that you tend to see used. So, that was not great and not ideal.
Yeah, certainly, given the fact that a lot of conservative kind of commentators have said, I disagree with the language, but there's a point to be made. And all of the people to the right of that are the ones who've agreed with the language. I think that's a pretty fair assessment. But of course, one of the kind of the main things that you've done in your own content is criticise Jim Ratcliffe's management of Manchester United Football Club. And there's a couple of angles to this in which there's been lots of criticism levied his direction. Let's start off with the kind of the financial side. Of course, he's now a minority shareholder in Manchester United and is now in charge of the day-to-day running of the club. What's been the financial impact of that, given the fact that he's obviously a multi-billionaire with certain class interests?
So technically I'd say he's actually not the majority owner. He's the minority owner. The Glazers still own most of the club. So he owns just shy of like 30% of Man United. I mean, it's like 28.9% or something like that. But as part of him coming in, I think basically the cost of acquiring Manchester United in full would be quite steep, even for Jim Ratcliffe, despite the fact that he is or was Britain, the wealthiest Brit, which is interesting in of itself. So the Glazers still own most of the club, who are the Americans that bought the club in the mid-2000s. Jim Ratcliffe, though, as part of, even though he's a minority owner, he actually controls the football operations. The reason being the Glazers are broadly despised, and they wanted to basically offload blame. Well, either it was sort of, it could go either way. If it goes well, that's good for them because they have a huge financial interest in the club doing well. They own most of the club. If the football side of things went badly, Jim Ratcliffe would be the fall guy instead of them because he's now the one calling the shots. Basically, on the football side of things have gone very badly because Man United finished third the season before Ratcliffe came in. They've been in a sort of downward spiral, as anyone who follows football even vaguely will know, ever since Sir Alex Ferguson retired. But in the last 2 years since Ratcliffe's been there, they've finished 8th and 15th. Man United finishing 15th is like just unheard of. So that hasn't gone very well. He slashed free lunches for staff. I think he said that he never got a free lunch in his in his line of work. He cut charitable donations. So there was like a charity that Man United had that would support players that played for them maybe in the 60s or 70s before there was a lot of money in football. Obviously, there's like well-documented things like dementia and all sorts among footballers, especially from yesteryear. They just got rid of that completely. And then when he was interviewed by Gary Neville, they said, couldn't you have just done like, because these are tiny amounts of money, some of these things. Like, I think that was like 40 or 50,000 pounds. Obviously, in the context of Manchester United, a tiny amount of money. And Gary Neville put it to him that, couldn't you have just done like one gala or dinner with some of the players and have raised the money that you've slashed from these former players? And he said, oh, well, to be fair, no one suggested that to me. So, no one said that at the time. I probably would. So, he doesn't always seem like the most with it, even just in terms of basic competence from that perspective.
I've been made aware that he also bought his share in the club through a leveraged buyout, which essentially means that a lot of this revenue is coming from the club itself rather than from him anyway. And on top of this, there was a story I did hear about the potential for there to be a new stadium. Was there anything that was going on in the background? Because there was not some public funding potentially involved in that?
Yeah, so I think the plans are still going ahead with the new stadium. I think the rumour is that it'll cost £2 billion. And yeah, he basically he said that his argument was that there's Wembley in the south of England, in London, which is obviously a centrally funded project, and that the north should have a Wembley. The difference there, obviously, is that Wembley is the national team stadium that the FA basically owns and operates, and Manchester United are a private company that would profit from a stadium being built for them. They generate enormous revenue in their own right. So it was, I think that was shut down fairly quickly, that idea. But yeah, it does show a sort of supreme arrogance that he left the country. Well, he relocated Ineos back in 2010 to avoid paying corporate taxes in the UK. Then he relocated himself, or re-domiciled himself in Monaco in 2020 to avoid paying personal tax in the UK, but felt that taxpayers who are still in the UK should front up an asset that he would then part own. So yeah, I think maybe there's a degree of arrogance and delusion there.
He was saying there was no such thing as a free lunch. It was their justification for cutting those free lunches for the staff at United itself. But apparently there is, in his mind, potentially a free lunch on offer if it's for funding for a stadium for him to be, again, as you say, a part owner of. And again, as you also correctly pointed out, he's very happy to move his businesses and his own personal finances abroad and then ridicule others for coming to this country and describing them as potentially colonisers in the language that he used on Sky News the other day. Although it's interesting, he's a Brexit supporter, which is probably why he was very happy to see United not in Europe anymore, which is quite funny. Specifically, though, in terms of how he's viewed by the fans, because, of course, the Glazer buyout of United was kind of viscerally despised by a lot of United fans. Has his new ownership stake since 2024 given him the same kind of response from the fans?
So, well, I should clarify that I'm not a Man United fan, just to be absolutely clear. But I think the way it goes in football, by and large, much as I would like this not to be the case, is if you do well, the owner tends to be relatively popular. If you do badly, they tend not to be. So in the case of Man City, obviously they're owned by the UAE, effectively. Technically, they're owned by Sheikh Mansour, but we need not get into that. But if Man United had been really successful, I think a lot of the stuff about sacking low-paid staff, cutting lunches, charity, etc., these things would have been, most fans would probably, but obviously there would be exceptions, people who are more engaged in these things and more socially minded would think it was bad. Of course, what Ratcliffe's done is he's had the combination of being deeply dislikable and the team being terrible. So, I would say he's fairly unpopular. There wasn't really a great... The options at the time for Man United were either a full takeover, it seemed, by the Qataris, or this part takeover by Jim Ratcliffe. Obviously, both were dubious in different ways. They ended up with the Ratcliffe route, which probably was from a football perspective, and you can take your pick from a moral perspective. Neither of them seem especially attractive on that front.
Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.